So the phrase psychedelic renaissance comes from a psychiatrist, Ben Sessa. He coined the term probably about 12 years ago to talk about the resurgence of interest in psychedelics. And, the Renaissance era we most commonly know as coming after the Enlightenment, which came after the invention of the printing press. So literacy became more widely available. There was a renaissance in artwork, specifically with the Medici family in Italy. You had Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and all these Italian painters who were supported by patrons, more or less, who wanted to see the resurgence of art out of the medieval ages. And so with sort of the psychedelic renaissance, we have, a topic or a substance that's been used for tens of thousands of years, and and was also widely used during the counterculture, and is now sort of finally coming back into our cultural awareness in a way that feels intentional and responsible. And so there's this resurgence of interest. I even refer to it as the third wave of psychedelics, meaning the first wave was the ancient and indigenous use, and the second wave is the counterculture. And it presents an opportunity to not only address mental health issues, but also to help us look at performance and creativity from a new and unique lens. And that's how psychedelics came into my life. I was raised in a pretty traditional family in West Michigan, Grand Rapids, and church was really the central and essential part of my life, as well as I played the violin and I played soccer and was pretty good in academics. So pretty standard middle class existence. And when I was 16, I tried cannabis for the first time, and my parents were not too happy about that. My dad sat me down one Sunday after church and said basically that he hadn't been this disappointed since his brother passed away in a car accident, in reference to me trying this illegal drug. So it was clearly impactful for them, probably even more so than for me to some degree. And then a few years after that, that same friend that introduced me to cannabis introduced me to psilocybin mushrooms and then LSD. And so at the age of 19, I had my first really meaningful experience with psychedelics. And one of the core insights that came from that experience was that I was raised in a culture and community that actually wasn't aligned with who I really was, my core values, and who I knew I was becoming, and that I would have to choose a more unconventional path if I wanted to become who I knew I was meant to become. And so those early psychedelic experiences set me down a path of becoming a digital nomad and traveling around the world, and then starting, my entrepreneurial journey. In 2015, I was living in Budapest, and it was at about the time where cannabis was starting to become more widely available. More states were legalizing cannabis. You had people like Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan who were starting to talk about psychedelics pretty publicly. And then there was a lot of clinical research coming out of places like NYU, Johns Hopkins, UCLA. And so I just sort of saw what was happening. And I thought, I think psychedelics are going to be the next thing after cannabis, this sort of illegal substance that becomes reevaluated for both medicinal and also performance benefits. And so at that point in time, I just started publishing free education and guides in a podcast under Third Wave. And that just has sort of grown and evolved over the last 9 years. And now in 2024, we're fully in the thick of this psychedelic renaissance, this third wave of psychedelic. Last year in the United States, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms. That's about 3.1% of the population. 4 million people microdosed psilocybin mushrooms, and 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic therapy. So we've made incredible strides in the last 9 years, and now we're sort of at the cusp of broader legalization and accessibility to these fascinating substances.
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. Got such, I think, profound insights to have for you at such a young age, 19. Like, like that's not the average things that, the 19-year-olds are thinking about. It's like, what am I here for? Like, am I going to be leading this kind of renaissance type of thing? Like when you initially went into that first experience, like, because I'm thinking back in my upbringing, right? We played around with mushrooms, and I say play around with them because that's actually what we were doing. You speak much more eloquently. Like, were you using it for healing purposes, or were you kind of your typical teenager back then? And it's like you're doing things that's kind of against the grain. Like, where was your mind prior to that first experience?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything in that way. I was I was always a prolific reader growing up. I was deeply curious. I remember when I was like 7 years old, we would have to keep track of how many books we read, and I read like 200 books or something insane when I was. So I was just deeply curious. I was always a little bit more introverted and curious, and so at the age of 19. I essentially the mushroom experience was interesting. That was about 2 grams of mushrooms. It was with 2 other friends, including this best friend of mine, and it was interesting, but not transformative. About 5 months after that, in May 2010, I did LSD for the first time, and that was essentially with 4 friends, and we went out into basically the woods and the beach for like 5 or 6 hours on this beautiful May day. So I didn't do it at a rave or a festival, but I also didn't do it necessarily therapeutically. It was a chance to connect with friends. It was definitely a chance to rebel, but I was also genuinely curious about what would happen and what I would experience. And I think, I mentioned this story with my parents, although they were, I grew up in a very sheltered environment. They were also very loving. There was a sense of unconditional love in that I could do what I wanted without fear of, let's say, retribution. And that was especially professionally, not so much personally, definitely around the drugs things, but especially professionally. And so I think I was fortunate that when I did start to do psychedelics at the age of 19 and 20, my parents, regardless of the path that I chose, were very supportive. Because a lot of parents who have, let's say, high functioning children, they want them to become lawyers or doctors. And then initially what I was studying medicine, or they want them to go to graduate school. And my parents were both very much like, just do what you want and we'll support you no matter what that is. And so I think there was, now obviously doing LSD was the exception to that, but there was some freedom and capability in that way. And I was also very fortunate that I had a reasonably good upbringing. My parents are still married. I had no major trauma with a big T, no addiction issues, no abuse issues, none of that. Like, we all have small traumas. Mine was mostly around guilt and shame, having been raised in a very sheltered religious environment, which I quickly worked through with psychedelics. So I didn't have to do a lot of this deep healing work. When I started working with psychedelics, it was just immediately I could go into more sort of dream state vision of, okay, if I could do anything with my life and my existence, what would that be? So I was very fortunate in that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love that you're bringing a unique perspective, because I think a lot of these conversations, at least the ones that we've had and kind of what you see in terms of the research and stuff that's being publicized out there, is the use of these medicines for therapeutic healing, the PTSD, the veteran community and all that. I love that you're bringing a different perspective on it. Your journey has been the opposite of that, because you've been able to lean into it as like you said, a performance enhancer, a creator enhancer, which we'll get into here in a minute on the microdosing side. But you talked about this third wave, and that's kind of how you see this third wave. That's the name of your organization. I think most people listening to this will understand that counterculture period right here in the States, 60s, 70s. It was kind of like this push of society up against, a hard government. A lot of these things were then kind of legalized back then. But I think what a lot of people maybe are not aware of is this first wave. Can you kind of talk about that first wave of psychedelic and the role that I played in maybe psychological evolution, societal evolution, or maybe if you have different language that you kind of use, like what role has this played in our development of human consciousness?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about that. So when I stopped studying medicine, I started to study history. And so the lens that I bring into the psychedelic space is pretty diverse and interdisciplinary, but it definitely does come from this historical context lens. So there's really 3, I would say, stories to focus on. The first story is that of Terence McKenna. So Terence McKenna was this Irish bard in the 1980s and 1990s who was a very eloquent speaker about psychedelics and altered states of consciousness. And he wrote a book called Food of the Gods in the early 90s, where he sort of laid out this hypothesis of the stoned ape theory. And the stoned ape theory essentially said that our ancient hominid ancestors, even prior to Homo sapiens, so 1 million, 2 million years ago, when they were on the savannas of Africa, they consumed psilocybin mushrooms, and that the consumption of psilocybin mushrooms was integral to our overall evolution and development, both in terms of brain capacity and how quickly the brain grew, and then also in our capacity to survive. Because when we take low doses of psilocybin mushrooms, and I can attest to this, when we take low doses of psilocybin mushrooms, our visual field significantly improves. And just as a really interesting anecdote, I used to, at the age of 10, I started to wear glasses. I was pretty nearsighted. That lasted until I was 22 or 23. And then as soon as I started to microdose consistently, my vision also dramatically improved to the point where I don't need glasses or contacts any longer to see long distances. So there's clearly something going on. And so McKenna hypothesized that, okay, mushrooms are pretty central then, both in our capacity to survive and hunt, because that's our visual field was essential in terms of our capacity to see and notice, but also in terms of the development of the brain and overall human consciousness. Now, we fast forward a little bit to the first ancient civilization, which was called Göbekli Tepe, which they've discovered about 30 or 40 years ago. It's in southeast Turkey, and it goes back about 9 to 10,000 years. And in the sort of rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe, they found chalices that they used for religious rites and ceremonies. And on those chalices, they've actually found remnants of psychedelics. And so in the oldest ancient civilization that we currently have available to us, there were clearly some rites or ceremonies that were done with, usually it was an alcohol like beer that was infused with some sort of psychoactive or psychedelic compound. And then more, what we have even stronger evidence for is in ancient Greece, there were these mysteries called the Eleusinian mysteries, and they drank a beverage called koukion in the Eleusinian mysteries. And the main ingredient in koukion was ergot. And ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, and it's the same thing that LSD is made. And so essentially you had for 2,000 years, these mysteries that existed in ancient Greece, where they drank a beverage that was made from essentially ancient LSD. And you had individuals like Plato and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius who participated in these mysteries. And when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, they banned and prohibited these mysteries. And that's why when LSD came back on the scene in the 60s, it was such a dramatic shift, because for 1700 years, we as a Western culture, Western sort of people had no access to psychedelic substance, or very minimal. It was here and there, but very minimal. And so the 60s was a massive experiment. And what if we introduce, a bunch of LSD into our culture and see what happens? And what we found out is that could really lead to a lot of destabilization. And although there was a lot of great clinical research published in the 50s and 60s on LSD, because it was so legal and accessible and available up until about 1966 when California banned it, you had a lot of people who were dropping out. And you had a lot of people who were even having psychotic breaks. And so what I say nowadays is the problem wasn't LSD necessarily. The problem was that we were just doing way too much of it, way too often. And that's why I think in modern times with this third wave of psychedelics, microdosing is such a great modality, because you can still experience a lot of the same physiological benefits in terms of its impact on neuroplasticity and inflammation, but you don't necessarily have the same level of risk that you might have if doing a very high dose of a psychedelic.